Golden Globes history and controversial moments, from Hollywood Outsider Club to industry Flashpoint. Introduction. The Golden Globes have always been a power test disguised as a party. They began as a small foreign press ritual in Los Angeles, then grew into a global broadcast that could lift careers, tilt campaigns, and set the emotional temperature for awards season. That tension never went away, a relatively small voting ecosystem carrying oversized cultural and commercial consequences, while the show sells itself as loose, funny, and slightly chaotic. Over time, the Globes became famous for two things at once: being early and influential, and being perpetually questioned about process, access, categories, taste, and ethics. The story turns on how legitimacy is built, traded, and repaired under bright lights. Key points. The Golden Globes are film and television awards that evolved from a small foreign press organization into a high-impact televised awards season signal. The decisive starting point is the early 1940s in Los Angeles, when foreign correspondents formalized an awards night that studios quickly learned to treat as a market-moving moment. Turning point, television transformed the ceremony into an entertainment product, making optics and room dynamics part of the Globe's authority. Turning point, modern campaigning professionalized the hunt for nominations, intensifying scrutiny of incentives, access, and governance. Biggest constraint shaping outcomes: credibility. Once audiences and studios doubt the process, the show's influence collapses fast. Hinge shock, a legitimacy crisis that led to a broadcast disruption and a governance reset that changed the institutional shape behind the brand. What changed most is oversight and public scrutiny. What endured is the Globe's role as an early season narrative engine with a uniquely volatile live format. Background. In mid-century Hollywood, prestige ran on pipelines. Studios needed coverage, talent needed visibility, and international markets needed a curated story about American films and stars. A small group of Los Angeles-based foreign correspondents sat in a useful position. They were close enough to the studios to get access, and foreign-facing enough to shape how Hollywood traveled beyond the US. The awards grew because they solved multiple needs at once: a news hook for journalists, a ritual of legitimacy for the industry, and a marketing moment for studios. Once television entered the picture, the Globes became more than an insider dinner. The broadcast became the product, and the product demanded spectacle, pace, and talkability. That pressure would eventually turn every perceived weakness into a headline. The Origin. The Origin is a modest awards event in the early 1940s that gained momentum because it created a repeatable prestige signal for films and later television. The enabling conditions were practical: a concentrated entertainment capital in Los Angeles, a publicity-driven studio system, and an international press group capable of amplifying winners beyond US borders. The format helped too. Compared with more solemn ceremonies, the Globes leaned into informality: tables, laughter, a sense of anything could happen, which made it a better broadcast engine once TV ambitions grew. That looseness became both a brand asset and a vulnerability, because fun can flip into not serious the moment governance is questioned. The next decades would test whether the party could keep its authority. The timeline. Phase 1. A small club builds a big signal, 1940s to 1960s. On the ground, the Globes moved from a niche journalist event to a recognized stop on Hollywood's calendar, shaped by post-war media expansion and the rising value of celebrity. The mechanism was institutional compounding. Once studios and talent treated the Globes as meaningful, participation became self-reinforcing. The constraint was scale. A relatively small organizer base had to manage growing attention without losing control of process and perception. Capacity shifted toward the organizers as the attention economy grew. A nomination could translate into bookings, headlines, and campaign momentum. Carryover locked in the Globe's core role, an early awards season signal that could frame narratives before other ceremonies landed. This influence made later controversies matter more. Phase 2. Television turns the ceremony into the product, 1970s to 1990s. On the ground, awards night became less about trophies and more about broadcast, hosting, pacing, reaction shots, and the social theatre of tables. The mechanism was commercial. Advertisers buy audience attention, and attention rewards spectacle. The constraint was tone management. The Globes needed to be glamorous and funny without looking unserious. And that balance is fragile in a live room full of power. Capacity shifted toward producers and networks because the show's format, what gets airtime, what becomes a clip, started shaping the Globe's reputation as much as the winners did. Carryover was a feedback loop. The more the show was treated as entertainment, the more its legitimacy became sensitive to optics. A party with power has to justify itself every year. Phase 3. The campaign machine era, 2000s to 2010s. On the ground, awards campaigning professionalized. Publicists, screeners, events, and carefully engineered narratives became routine. The mechanism was incentives. If a win moves markets, tickets, subscriptions, prestige, then attention concentrates around whoever controls the vote. The constraint was reputational fragility. Any perception that outcomes could be worked more easily than rival awards would shrink the value of the prize. Capacity shifted toward campaigns that could manage the full pipeline: visibility, access, timing, and story. The Globes became a strategic target because they were early and televised. Carryover was the slow growth of cynicism. People could enjoy the show while doubting the system. That contradiction does not stay quiet for long. Phase 4. Hosting becomes a public audit, 2010s to mid-2020s. On the ground, hosts became a referendum on Hollywood's self-image. Who gets mocked, who laughs, who looks furious, and what that says about the industry. The mechanism was attention economics. A sharp monologue generates headlines and clips, extending the show far beyond the broadcast. The constraint was audience fragmentation. A joke can land as truth-telling for one audience and punching down for another, and backlash cycles now travel faster than the ceremony itself. Capacity shifted toward the clip economy. A single moment could dominate coverage more than the awards. Carryover is that the Globes compete as much in the meme ecosystem as in prestige. The room became part of the story. Phase 5. The legitimacy crisis and institutional reset, 2021 to 2023. On the ground, the Globes faced a credibility emergency tied to governance, ethics, and representation debates, which quickly spilled into sponsorship and broadcast risk. The mechanism was institutional withdrawal. Once major partners publicly distance themselves, the ceremony's authority collapses in full view. The constraint was time. Reforming governance is slow, but reputational damage moves at headline speed. The hinge was the broadcast disruption and the subsequent institutional reset that changed who owned the show and how the brand was managed. Alternatives were limited because the Globe's power depends on partners, networks, advertisers, studios who can walk away. When the pipeline breaks, the party cannot pay for itself. Phase 6. Rebuild, rebrand, and repeat the test, 2024 to 2026. On the ground, each ceremony now doubles as a referendum on whether the Globes have earned continued attention. The mechanism is governance signalling, structural changes, voter expansion claims, and new accountability language designed to stabilize trust. The constraint is memory. Audiences remember scandals longer than reforms, and any new misstep gets interpreted as proof nothing changed. Capacity shifts only if the public believes the safeguards are real, not cosmetic. Carryover is simple. The Globes survived by changing their institutional shell, but they still have to win the same argument every year. A rebuilt stage still needs a believable script. Most controversial moments throughout history. The Globe's most notorious moments cluster around one theme: when incentives make outcomes look purchasable, or when the broadcast turns discomfort into spectacle. The bought-win era allegations, 1980s. A defining controversy involved a widely criticised win that sparked allegations of lavish wooing and impropriety. The details became less important than the signal it sent. A small voting body could look vulnerable to access and perks. The damage was structural. Studios and broadcasters do not need certainty to panic. They only need a plausible story that undermines trust. That moment taught Hollywood a brutal lesson. Prestige collapses when the process looks negotiable. The watch gifting and access rumours, late 1990s. Another recurring flashpoint was the perception that gifts and hospitality could soften the line between coverage and influence. Even when claims were disputed or loosely evidenced in public memory, the effect was the same. The Globes became an easy punchline for soft legitimacy. Once that reputation sticks, every surprising result is interpreted through the same lens. The Wild Room broadcast moments, 2000s. The Globe's table format makes it uniquely vulnerable to live awkwardness, unplanned interactions, visible intoxication, and speeches that drift into chaos. Those moments are entertaining, but they also create a shadow narrative. If the show looks uncontrolled, people assume the institution is uncontrolled. A ceremony that sells looseness has to work twice as hard to prove seriousness. Hosting backlash cycles, 2010s to 2020s. Some hosts earned praise for puncturing celebrity self-seriousness. Others triggered backlash for jokes that felt cruel, dated, or miscalculated. The controversy isn't only the joke, it's the mechanism. Hosts now function as a live editorial board, deciding in real time which moral lines the room will tolerate. When the room looks uncomfortable, the legitimacy conversation starts again. The modern legitimacy crisis and public breaks, early 2020s. The most consequential controversy was not a single joke or win, but a credibility rupture that led to public distancing by industry figures and a major disruption to the broadcast. Unlike earlier scandals that the brand could outlast, this one threatened the system's inputs, partner confidence, sponsor comfort, and talent participation. Once those inputs wobble, the Globes stop being an awards show and start being a liability. The post-reset anything could reignite era, 2020s to present. After institutional changes, the Globes entered a new stage where small moments are amplified as tests of whether reform is real. One awkward segment can trigger a week of nothing changed commentary. One clean year can slowly rebuild confidence. The scandal pattern persists because the underlying constraint persists. Trust is the product. Consequences. In the short run, the Golden Globes shaped awards season momentum by moving early, creating narratives and packaging prestige into a broadcast-friendly spectacle. The second-order effects were bigger. The Globes helped normalize the idea that entertainment awards are governance systems. Membership rules, voting structures, category definitions, and conflicts of interest shape what excellence looks like in public. When legitimacy cracks, downstream impacts hit quickly. Studios reassess campaign spend, talent calibrates participation, and broadcasters treat the show as reputational risk rather than a tentpole. In the longer run, the Globes became a case study in institutional survival. When authority is built on trust and attention, you either adapt governance or you lose the platform. The next cycle will keep testing whether reform can outperform memory. What most people miss. The Globes are not just an awards show, they are a credibility marketplace where access, optics, and governance signals are constantly priced in. Because the ceremony is informal and highly televised, room dynamics matter more than people admit. Laughter, silence, and reaction shots function like public audits of legitimacy. That's why controversies feel amplified. The Globes don't merely announce winners, they broadcast the social mechanics of Hollywood, deciding what it values. If the mechanics look compromised, the prize looks smaller. What endured? The Globes stayed bound to the attention economy. The show's value depends on being watched, clipped, and debated. They stayed bound to categorization fights because film and TV keep changing faster than labels can keep up. They stayed bound to campaign pressure because early season wins still translate into momentum and money. They stayed bound to the tension between insider glamour and outsider judgment because that is the Globe's original identity. They stayed bound to the same core constraint. Legitimacy is harder to rebuild than to lose. Next year's ceremony will still be graded on trust before taste. Disputed and uncertain points. How much influence the Globes have on later awards is debated because correlation is easy to see and causation is hard to prove across complex campaigns. The line between normal campaigning and improper influence is historically blurry because publicity has always involved access, hosting, and relationship management. Some controversies are remembered as scandals largely through repetition, even when the hard evidence remains disputed or circumstantial in public accounts. The effectiveness of reforms is contested. Structural changes can be real, while public confidence lags behind for years. The meaning of representation in a voting body is debated. Membership shifts do not automatically change incentives, tastes, or perceived fairness. Legacy. The Golden Globe's lasting legacy is institutional and cultural. They proved an awards show can be both a prestige engine and a credibility liability, depending on how governance is perceived. They also demonstrated a modern rule of cultural power. Attention is not enough. People now ask who votes, under what incentives, and with what safeguards, because the ritual shapes careers, money, and memory. The Globes survived by changing their institutional shell rather than abandoning the brand. And that choice turned the ceremony into a yearly legitimacy checkpoint as much as an awards night. The theme is not that Hollywood is fickle. The theme is that authority in entertainment is always conditional, and the conditions are now visible. Subscribe on Spotify or explore more articles on taylortailored.co.uk for more compelling insight.